Hello and welcome to SLP Full Disclosure. I am your host, Jennifer Martin, and joining me today, we have Amy Graham, and we are going to talk about speech sound disorders and differential diagnosis. And before we jump into that, I just want to give a shout out and thank our sponsor. A reminder, this episode is sponsored by AMN Passport. We all know that life can get busy, and that is why AMN created Travel Healthcare's highest rated mobile app that helps you to find, book, and manage your next healthcare assignment all from the palm of your hand. AMN Passport puts you on the fast track to your next travel job. Receive instant job match notifications when you download AMN Passport today. All right, so now, before we get into this episode, which I think is so well timed because this is always something that we're going to be dealing with as speech pathologists or speech sound disorders, but perfect timing before the school year starts. And this will be such a great learning opportunity for all of us. But let me tell you about our amazing guest, Amy Graham. She received both her bachelor's and master's degrees in communication disorders from California State University, Fullerton, and has been a speech language pathologist for over 20 years. She owns Graham Speech Therapy, which is a private practice in Colorado Springs that specializes in the assessment and treatment of children with speech sound disorders. Amy frequently travels across the country to train SLPs on various evidence-based practices regarding the assessment and treatment of speech sound disorders and is the creator of numerous speech sound disorder specific assessment and therapy resources. She has been a guest on numerous SLP podcasts and has a particular interest in supporting and equipping SLPs by posting frequent therapy videos and practical therapy tips on her social media platforms. And I can attest to that because I have visited them several times. So welcome, Amy. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Yeah, you have such, and we'll get into this too, but this is one of the things I always say about SLPs. I feel like it's a very generous profession, and so many people that are experts and kind of have this very specific expertise are so generous about sharing that information and like you said in your bio, just helping to equip other SLPs. So thank you for doing that and providing all those great resources for everyone.
Thanks. I just know as an SLP, I did not get into this profession for the money.
What?
I know, right? We're not necessarily, rolling in it over here as SLPs, but so, I think I have a heart for especially SLPs in the schools because I started out in the schools. So I try to make the information that I have learned that's evidence-based, just accessible and, and give people, ideas about where to go to get more information about topics, especially related to speech sound disorders, since that's kind of my niche area.
Yes. And I can't wait to dive into it because I just feel like even in just looking into this before this episode, I feel like there's a lot has changed since I got out of grad school. So excited. Probably since last month, a lot has changed, but still. Before we get into it, I just would love to know, what led you into this field and kind of what was your journey to where you are now with your private practice?
Yeah. So I learned about the field young because my sister had speech therapy, and she, now knowing what I know now, she had a phonological deficit when she was a preschooler, and that kind of morphed, that was corrected and remediated, and that kind of morphed into a residual lateral lisp of some sounds. And so in my mind, I thought speech therapy was for kids who had trouble with R's and S's. Like that's what most people think SLPs do. And so I thought that sounded like fun, honestly. And so that's how I got into the field, or at least interested in it. And so when I transferred to the university I was attending, Cal State Fullerton in California, got into the program and, kind of got into the field a little bit and learning about all the courses that we had to take and the scope of practice. I thought, oh my goodness, there's so much more to SLP than just fixing kids' speech sounds. However, if you are an SLP and you end up going in the schools, it's still a really big part of what we do. So I feel like I got into the field for that, and I actually kind of found or really kind of fell in love with that too. So now that's what I do. So I do fix kids' R's and S's. That's kind of what I do now. But I also treat kids who have phonological deficits and childhood apraxia of speech and dysarthria and basically anything in the whole realm or under that umbrella of speech sound disorders. And I think the more that, the more I go, like you said, the research changes, the evidence-based changes. It does. It's ever evolving. And so some things that I learned in the 90s aren't necessarily best practice now. And so it's, you kind of have to stay fresh, which is why I started, or part of the reason kind of I started my social media is for that reason, like let's get the word out there. Let's get evidence-based and get the updated literature out there to SLPs. It's a really quick and great way. It can be a great way to spread accurate information if indeed the information is accurate, which is something that we need to keep an eye out for as consumers. Yes. But I started out back to my how I got into doing what I am now. What I'm doing now is I started out in the schools when I graduated, so back in 99. And so I went into the schools, did my CFY in the schools, worked for different school districts, and eventually ended up working for a private contract company where I actually ended up doing a lot of long-term sub jobs. So in our field, there's a lot of women and a lot of us go on maternity leave. And so that's who I got to fill in for. So I probably, this was back in Southern California. I'm in Colorado now. But when I was out there, I probably worked in dozens of schools because I would just work for a couple of months and then go to the next assignment. And so what I found was as I began to kind of rediscover my love for speech sound disorders, that if I worked with these kids for this short period of time, but I really spent some time analyzing, okay, what is their specific deficit? What type of underlying deficit do they have? Not just RTIC. There's a lot more to speech than just RTIC. If I matched an intervention to their specific deficit, I could see gains in those 2 months that I was with them. And so I loved that about speech sound disorders because I knew, working with some other kids with different types of deficits, we don't always see that real-time improvement right before our eyes in the moment. And so it was it's just gratifying and rewarding when you see that happen. And so that's when I just decided that I love this. I want to do this. It's all I want to do. Because as you know, our scope of practice is so enormous that I wanted to be good at one thing instead of just kind of okay at all the things. And so that's why I decided to open my private practice and specialize in speech sound disorders. I did that started in 2016, April of 2016. And I've just slowly kind of maintained a very part-time practice. And because I've kind of morphed into doing more professional development. And so that's pretty much taking up most of my time now is doing professional development for SLPs and just in the realm of speech sound disorders. So I travel a lot. I do a lot of recordings, live webinars, things like that. But I still always maintain that small private caseload. I see kids on Tuesdays. Just so that I can, for one, it keeps me fresh. Just when you think you've got it all down, I know how to do this, you'll get that kid that teaches you, no, you don't know all the things yet. And so it keeps me on my toes. And so I always try to maintain that private caseload, but that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just private right now.
Well, I love that your sister was kind of the inspiration for all this and, really being able to see the impact that some of those things have on somebody that is so close to you, and then being able to say, okay, I want to do something similar to help people as well. I think that's really cool. And I also, the whole piece about really just the evidence base and staying on top of that, and just, again, being so kind with sharing those resources. It really is such a great service just to the field, because you're right. If we have evidence-based practices and are doing things that are going to make a difference, it only helps our entire profession. And so I love that, it's like, okay, I've got the secret sauce, only I know it. It's like, no, to have this information and the fact that you're now taking it, doing less clinical work, but doing, on a greater scale, helping people to understand. Again, it just only helps. That's what helps us to And when you know better, you do better. Well, someone's got to take the time to help us know better. So I
Yeah,
love
and
that
I
you're
know,
expanded.
and I know sometimes as an SLP, we have to get our CEUs or our
Hmm.
kid, our professional development hours. And I've been sitting there at times like, okay, one more thing to have to learn. And it can be kind of daunting, especially if it might be a new technique or a new intervention that you're not used to. But my hope, and I tell SLPs when I speak to them, that here's the thing. This might actually get kids off your caseload quicker. So I
Yes.
am all about efficiency. I am all about working smarter, not harder. Like if you've got big caseloads in schools, if you just pick one or two interventions, new interventions to put into your toolbox, and you find the kid that's going to work for, that kid will be off your caseload faster. So it's going to make your life
Yes.
easier. It might take a little bit of work in the short term, but in the long run, it's going to be so much more beneficial for you, just your workload, your
Mhm.
caseload, and that child. They're going to just
Yeah.
improve much more rapidly.
Yeah, I was just thinking that then it directly impacts, I think we're more likely to not feel burnt out when it's like, oh, the goal is for them not to be in speech therapy for their whole lives. I mean, some
Right.
people, yes, they're going to need that, but others like, let's do what we need to get you back where you need to be. And then that does, I think has more professional fulfillment, but it's also,
Hmm.
like you said, what we want for the clients and students we're working with.
Yeah. And that's what I tell
So
my parents when I have a new family. My goal is for you not to come see me anymore. I want to work
yes.
myself out of a job. I don't want you to
Yes.
have to come here anymore. I don't want any long, for speech sound disorders, unless
Yeah.
it's, there's specific deficits that take longer to remediate. But for the most part, I want your child to be improving every week.
Yep. It's like I tell my doctor every year at the yearly checkup. I'm like, great, I really like you. I don't want to see you for a year. All right. And he
Yep.
said, me neither. Feelings
Right.
mutual. So yeah, you're right. I love that you set that up from the beginning because I think that is a good reminder that remember, the goal is to eventually graduate from this. So,
Right. Exactly.
and so Amy, remind us, would you tell us what falls under that umbrella of speech sound disorders?
Yeah, so I kind of think of it as kind of a spectrum in a way. I know when I was in the schools, we tended to use the term artic or articulation to mean all things related to speech. But when we're talking about articulation, or especially when I'm referring to an articulation deficit, what I'm talking about is an issue with the motor production of a particular sound, the phonetic motor production, getting your articulators in the right place. That's what we're talking about. But when we're talking about more phonological based errors, those preschoolers, early elementary age kids who have more consistent pattern based or rules based errors, it's not just about having difficulty learning the motor production of the sound. But the underlying deficit for those kids is also understanding the rules for how those sounds are used in language, how they're used to change meanings of words. And so that's why I get lots of DMs on Instagram. I try to answer them all. I don't always get to them. But if I had a parent not that long ago DM me and say, I don't understand what is wrong with my son. I will tell him like you do, I say, make the snake sound. And he can do it. He does it great. And then I say, okay, now say the word snow. And he goes, no. Because it's not about articulation. It's not that he doesn't have the ability to produce the S sound. It's that he doesn't understand the rule that in order to change the word no to snow, it has to have an S at the beginning. And so that's why a lot of times if we treat kids who have phonological deficits with an articulation motor-based type of intervention that we're used to, that's a really common traditional way of remediating that, we get overgeneralization because kids just think, oh, you just want me to put S on everything. We're not teaching them the rule that no, only this word has S, this one doesn't. And so there are specific interventions that address that. But then we also, under that umbrella of speech sound disorders, have our motor speech deficits, our motor speech disorders like apraxia, where it's not about a sound or the sound. It's not about a pattern of errors. It's a movement-based deficit where It's a difficulty with motor planning, motor programming, where kids have difficulty producing intelligible, consistent, fluid speech. And so those kids present differently and they require much different types of interventions, even as with dysarthria, where it's not motor planning, but it's motor weakness or motor execution deficit due to muscle weakness. And so we're going to use different types of strategies to treat the underlying reduced intelligibility that those kids present with, because again, it's about the sound, which is articulation, or it's about the pattern, which is phonology, or it's about movement, which is apraxia or dysarthria. And then we actually have the kids, which is most of my caseload, and it's probably most of everybody's caseload, where they kind of have a combination of one, two, or both of, or all three of those, right? Like you might have a child with phonological deficits and maybe a lateral lisp, which would be an articulation motor-based mislearning of a sound. Or maybe they have a history of apraxia where they have those inconsistencies, deficits of prosody and things like that. But they also, and maybe as their motor speech system improves, they kind of have some really consistent phonological errors on top of it. So we kind of have to understand, okay, what really is the nature of the child's deficit? Because they're treated very differently. And so if we can understand that, if we can get to the heart of, okay, what's really going on with this child, then we're going to be able to help them much more efficiently.
Okay. Wow. When I'm thinking about, oftentimes we have guests on, I start to have my thought bubble of, oh, wow. Yes, I was doing blank, 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 because as you're saying this, each is so unique, but then overlaps, which makes it even that much more complex.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm thinking about, just again, back in the day when I was working in schools and didn't have all this information that you have stored in your head, is treating the phonological with the same way as the artic. And you're exactly right. As you're saying it, I'm like, well, no wonder my students never got out of speech.
It takes
I'd like to apologize now to all of you.
And this is a word to the newer SLPs. You're going to look back at yourself 10 years down the road and think, oh my gosh, because we all do, right? I mean, we can't. Grad school cannot teach us everything we need to know. It's just too much. And so I still have those moments, even like from I've been an SLP for 3 years, however long that is. And even I'll think of a kid last year, like, oh man, I wish I'd have known about this back, last year, or I would have helped him a little bit better. So yeah, we've all been there and we'll continue to be there.
Yeah. But this is why I think, just again, to go back to why it's so important to just don't ever think like, oh, I've got that. I understand it. I know what I was taught. Because had I continued, then now, with what you're saying, I'm like, oh my gosh, of course, that makes perfect sense. But, okay, so that helps tremendously. So, when you were first going down this road of looking at each of these different parts of speech sound disorders, what did you do to kind of get yourself prepared and resources? Did you have something that seemed to really just help you have a better understanding of each of these distinct areas?
Well, I think, first of all, I was very blessed that I had a really great grad school program that started me off on the right foot. So I'm really very grateful for our speech sound disorders courses. I've talked to some SLPs and they say that they haven't had a speech sound disorders graduate course. And I'm wondering how that's possible. Blows my mind, because if you're an SLP in the schools, I mean, that's going to be probably more than half of what you do. So I'm happy that I started out well, but I also think I had one professor tell me that you always have to stay evergreen. You can't just think you've got it and then just, treat all the kids the same way. There's the literature, the research in our field is ever evolving. Like there will be, you heard about maybe the new speech norms that broke the internet a couple of years ago, right? That came out in 2020 about the average age of acquisition for speech sounds among kids. And it was a lot younger than a lot of us thought it was. Not because anything is new, just because we really weren't looking at the data correctly before. And so they kind of fixed it for us. And so, I think, we just kind of have to stay updated. So I think for me, it's about keeping my finger on the pulse of the literature that comes out, taking professional development courses, knowing who the names are, who the names of who the researchers are that actually are the creators of some of these interventions that we all use, and keeping up with what they're doing. And so that's what I try to do. And now, especially since COVID, I feel like there are so many more Zoom conferences and, online professional development. I try to keep up with as much as I can. I subscribe to the Informed SLP, which is a really great way to keep up with, keep up with bite-sized chunks of the new literature that's coming out, and you get, monthly updates on that. I always try to go to ASHA. It's expensive, but it's so valuable because you get to actually meet the researchers and meet the people that are presenting, and I love that. So to me, that's we always have to be trying to keep up with what we can. And honestly, if I were in the schools, I don't think I could, because as a generalist SLP, there's so many things to keep up with. So when I was in the schools, I would just pick one area. This year, this is what I'm going to learn a little more about, just not to be overwhelmed. So I know I can say, you have to learn about all these interventions, but take your time because it's a lot. I mean, even for me as an SLP, there's some interventions that are within speech sound disorders I'm still learning about and still figuring out how to implement with my kids. So it is a lot, but I just try to learn in little bite-sized pieces every year, pick something new, learn about it, take professional development on it. And I do go to ASHA. I love ASHA. It's so much fun.
No, and that's great advice, because I do feel, to your point, it can get so overwhelming where, I tell everybody, we do everything from the neck up. So there's a whole lot that you could learn about. So I love the idea of just taking it this year. My goal is to learn more about blank. And you're right, now it's more accessible with the online stuff. And even I believe you can still go to ASHA virtually. I know it's not the same as being there, but just because it does, sometimes these things get so expensive. So yeah, sure. I love those ideas. And just, there's also the free journals that have some information, and just, people like yourself.
There's a lot of free resources, lot of free resources for sure. Yeah. In fact, I have a resources, I'll plug it now on my website, grahamspeechtherapy.com. There's a resources tab, because I talk a lot about different types of interventions, and I try to link all the free resources, all the free journal articles, all the ASHA Wire articles that have come out, because, sometimes it's hard to just go and do a Google search and know, is this the right thing? What am I looking for here? So yeah, there's a lot of free resources out there too.
Well, what I like about that as well is that, you're very reputable in this space. And so when somebody that's really reputable and has done a great job in this space says, hey, these are the resources I recommend, it just takes out some of the guesswork for you. So it's oh, great. This person's recommending it. Awesome. I'm going to look into it. So yeah, that's a great idea. So now when you start working with a child, and I know you have, this may be hard to pinpoint, but just trying to get an idea for those out there that, that may be working with students that have speech sound disorders, or maybe thinking about it. What's kind of the average age where you begin working with a child? And if you can, what's kind of your most common area you're working with, or
Yeah, I think to some degree it depends on the nature and the severity of the child's speech sound disorder. Yeah. So if I have a child who is really highly unintelligible or very delayed in their speech production, I've had 3-year-olds that have only vowels, so we're working on, okay, let's get some consonants in here. So usually 3 is the earliest that I will see kids, because so much speech development happens between 0 and 3. And by the time kids are 3, that's when those phonological error patterns begin to start to disappear. And if they're not, by 3, 3.5, 4, then it's time to really think about remediating those and getting some direct therapy. But like I said, sometimes it just depends on the nature of the deficit. So if you have a child who has a lateral lisp or that R distortion, those RNS kids that tend to be our 8, 9, 10-year-olds on our caseloads, sometimes I don't see those kids till later, because parents think, oh, they're going to grow out of it. And then sometimes they wait. And so I'll see those kids anywhere from 6, 8, 12, 15. Sometimes I get my older kids where you're thinking, oh boy, I wish I had gotten you earlier. But, since I'm a private practitioner too, I'm often dependent on parent referring themselves. And so they have to realize that there's an issue before they reach out to somebody like me, where if you're in the schools, teachers are screening, SLPs are kind of screening, keeping an ear out. And so sometimes they're caught a little bit earlier. Or sometimes they don't qualify for services in the schools. If it's like a single sound error and they're awesome and it's not impacting them socially. And so parents wait because it's not a big issue, or they didn't qualify in the school. So I'll see older kids like that. I see a lot of younger, even school-aged children with childhood apraxia of speech where they just haven't been progressing, and they've been in speech therapy, but they can't figure out why they're not progressing, and somebody suspects apraxia, so then they come see me at maybe 4, 6, 8, I'll name the ages. It just kind of depends on, like I said, the nature and the severity of the deficit. But I probably always have anywhere from 3-year-olds to teenagers on my caseload at any given moment.
Yeah. And I'm sure, I feel like it's gotten a lot better that now pediatricians are more aware of, we need to seek some support in this area. But I do feel like there was a chunk of time where it was like, oh, wait and see, they'll grow out of it.
Yeah.
I think that's improving, luckily, but
I hope
yeah. So. Yeah, because that wait and see, it's like, no, that's not. But do you find if it's earlier than 3, let's say a 2-year-old, is it hard to address some of these, because they may not have a ton of sounds, but also like that actual motivation or working with that age?
The intervention is going to be different, right? Those I am not an early intervention SLP. I will tell you right now. If I get down, I will get down on the floor with my preschoolers, but it's going to take me a minute to get up. So I do not see my early intervention kids, because really you have to be very play-based and very interactive and very child-led, which can be, it's fantastic for language enrichment. But when we're really trying to do the kind of therapy that we need for direct speech sound disorder type of intervention, you do kind of have to have some of those skills of I say, you say, even if you can be very play-based, it can be very, back and forth, playing with toys. I do that with my 3 and 4-year-olds all the time, but it's much more difficult to do with those 2-year-olds. So I feel like it's almost a different skill set, really. Like it is a different skill set. Like those play-based SLPs, they're amazing. I'm in awe. That is not who I am. We try to have fun, but when we're doing really direct speech sound disorders type of intervention, in order to implement with fidelity the types of interventions required for a speech sound disorder, we do have to get a lot of trials. And so sometimes we have to think of what are activities that are going to facilitate that. And frequently it's turn taking and, we're going to build something, but I get to have control of the items, and then we're going to practice some words while we build something with these different things. So yeah, it is very different. And like I said, there's a lot of development that can happen by the time a child turns 3, even if they're 2, 2.5, and you think, oh my gosh, maybe there's a speech sound disorder, which could be the case for sure. But it could be just they're delayed. They need a little extra time. But again, we got to keep an eye out for those atypical or signs of disorder versus delay. Because there are some types of errors that are more indicative of a more severe deficit. Like, I'm just thinking of backing, right? A child who's backing their alveolars to those back sounds. That does not occur in typical speech development. So that's more of a disorder. Lateral lisps, disordered speech, because it does not occur in typical speech development. Initial consonant deletion. So there's all those things that we can, as SLPs, we can work on with our little ones and try to encourage it and start to get them to imitate it. But I usually refer those kids to our early intervention services, which are free here in El Paso County in Colorado, because our SLPs here are so great at teaching parents how to encourage kids to look at your mouth when you say it, talk about the sounds and that kind of thing. But yeah, that's pretty much why I pretty much stick to 3 years old. Just some of those underlying skills just aren't quite there yet for the kind of therapy that I do.
Yeah, no, I did early intervention for years, and you're right. I think back, I'm like, how did I do that all day? I don't
I
have
don't
that energy
know.
now. But yeah, so I
It,
completely hear what you're saying.
it's a young
Yeah,
SLP's game, maybe.
I think that is key. So I want to switch gears and talk about differential diagnosis and utilizing that when assessing and addressing some of these speech sound disorders. But first, can you just tell us what is differential diagnosis, and how is this different if it is than saying an official diagnosis? Help
Yeah.
understand that.
Yeah. So really we are speech pathologists. So
Hmm.
we can diagnose. And I think we as SLP sometimes forget that, especially in the schools, if we've been told by administrators that we can't diagnose, you can't use this term or that term. Some people can't use the term apraxia, but even if you can't use the term maybe in your report, which is really wrong because it's not a medical, there's a misunderstanding about some things, even about apraxia. It's not a medical diagnosis. It is a motor speech sound disorder that can only be diagnosed by an SLP who has expertise in apraxia. So we need to remember that too. So what it is just getting all the information in your assessment that will help you really for the purpose of you as a SLP deciding what's going to be the best intervention. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to get to the bottom of, okay, what's really going on here? Is this a motor-based issue? Is it a linguistic-based issue? Is it phonological? Is it motor planning? And there are certain things that we can add to our assessment battery that I may not use for all my kids, but if I suspect apraxia or if I suspect phonological deficits, I'm going to do different types of assessments for those kids to get to the bottom of what is really going on. And so I have an assessment checklist that I use. It's a free download on my website too, that I think has helped a lot of SLPs. It's not all encompassing, but it helps me keep me on track with, okay, have I gotten a case history form? Have I asked parents about particulars of other aspects of their life, of their medical history, of their family history, I ask about feeding and eating history because that can be really informative if we're trying to look at underlying motor-based or functional deficits of the articulators. So I want to make sure I get all that information because that can help me decide, okay, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe there's a underlying myofunctional deficit with this child that might need to be remediated with another professional. Has their hearing been checked? Have I measured intelligibility? So it's not just about get your Goldman Fristo, right? And list out the 23 sound substitutions they have, but it's all these other things. It's basically making your assessment more dynamic. And I know we talk about dynamic assessment in other avenues of our profession, but it's really important for it to be dynamic in speech sound disorders as well too, because when you do like your single word articulation test, whatever articulation test you give, I don't even care. People ask me what I use. I'm like, I can use anything. It doesn't matter. I just want something to get that child to say some words so I can compare it to the adult counterpart and we can figure out how they're simplifying that word. And I analyze it. We have to spend some time analyzing what is going on with that child's speech in order to get to the bottom of it. So getting your articulation errors, yeah, write that down, but then look a little bit further and say, oh, you know what? All of their fricatives, they don't have any fricatives. They're using stop consonants for all their fricatives. That's stopping. And that's a phonological error pattern. Or they don't have any fricatives, but man, all of their errors are very, very inconsistent. Maybe they're deleting it here, but they're distorting it here, and then they're substituting it here. If I see inconsistency, I'm thinking, okay, I need to look at how inconsistent are there? Maybe it's inconsistent speech disorder. Maybe it's apraxia. And so we need to kind of gear our assessment to look at that and make it much more dynamic in order to tell. Things like stimulability. Don't just give the test and walk away. Go back to those errored sounds and say, so like if rabbit, right? Okay, buddy, let's try this word again. Rabbit. Can you say it like I do? And just give them a model. And if they can produce that word with a model, Maybe they were erred the first time when they said wabbit the first time, but when you say it, they say rabbit. That means they're stimulable, and that sound is much more likely to emerge without direct intervention. So it can be informative about what you need to or don't need to address in therapy. If a child is stimulable for all these things, and this is what I tell school-based SLPs too, if you probe for stimulability, maybe that kid doesn't need to come on your caseload, because if they're stimulable, I'm much more comfortable saying, you know what, let's revisit this child in 6 months and see what's emerged. And most of the time, they're going to be improving. If they're not stimulable for anything though, I'm much more likely to bring them on my caseload and consider working on those non-stimulable sounds, because I know they're not going to emerge on their own. So there's a lot of things that assessment can really help you kind of walk through and think through. Doing an oral mech exam, I kind of started in social media talking about oral mech exams, and because I was finding out that a lot of SLPs weren't doing them. And it's really a quick 5 to 10 minute type of thing we can add to our assessment battery that can be incredibly informative, even if just to rule out anything structural or functional that might be impacting a child's ability or inability to produce a sound. And it's really easy. It's really quick and easy to do. So just kind of thinking through, okay, have we looked at everything that's going to give me that information versus here are their 43 sound errors that they have, right? Like that's just not enough really to give that differential diagnosis. We need to dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah. And I'm thinking as you're saying this, that this seems like it should be like a lot. I know, and again, I know SLPs are not sitting around twiddling their thumbs. Like if you're an SLP, you're busy. And especially if you're in the school or working with kids. So, but it does seem like it just makes so much more sense to really spend more time on this process and this differential diagnosis, because you're exactly right. You know, what you said in the beginning is depending on what's going on, you're going to treat it differently. So if you don't have an accurate picture of what's going on and you start treating it one way where it's really not that, then you're wasting your time, and then you're spending more time on the back end versus the front end. So it just, hearing you say this, it makes such perfect sense that you have to have a really good understanding of what's going on. Then when you implement that treatment, it's just going to automatically be more effective because you're treating the right thing.
Exactly. And I think we have to also think critically through what we're finding, because you might find, like, just for an example, you might find some things during your oral mech exam. You might find a tongue tie. You might find, some things you think, oh no, is this why they're having trouble with this sound? But we have to, as SLPs, to think critically about what we are seeing and analyze it and really kind of think through it. Here's an example. I had a set of twins, identical speech sound errors going on, of course, identical twins. But they came to me, they had been in therapy for, I believe, about 6 months doing some myofunctional work, because they found that, and if people are unfamiliar with what orofacial myology is, it's about, basically upper airway issues and getting that tongue to just move more efficiently during the swallow, at rest. And so this was discovered by this SLP that, they had some issues there. And so they worked on that for 6 months. Their speech never improved. Never. And so they came to me for an assessment. I did the assessment and come to find out they had phonological errors. So working on the structure and, getting range of movement better with their tongue was not doing anything to address their underlying deficit, which was gliding and fronting. And I think they were doing I think they had 3 error patterns going on. In 2 months, we remediated fronting, and it was just gone because I used the right intervention. We used minimal pairs. So that's just one example of, like, you might find some things, but we have to think critically. Okay, you might find some interesting things during your oral mech exam, but that's what's causing the deficit? If they have more phonological based errors, that's likely not a huge contributor. It might be a somewhat of a contributor, but if their errors are phonological, we need a phonological intervention, not a motor-based intervention.
Yeah. And this makes such sense too, where, doing an RTIC test and then just taking that data to make, goals or decide that's not going to be enough. So it sounds like there needs to be, not only looking at physiologically what's happening, but also just some of the rule-based and even, mix of formal and informal and the stimulatability and all those pieces. And do you find that, when you look at all those pieces together, are you almost always able to come up with an official diagnosis following that? Or is there ever a time when it's like, I still don't know, and I'm not sure what we're going to do about this?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it takes a little bit longer than others, especially for more complex cases. And there are complex cases out there where you're thinking, yeah, I'm not sure. I think this might be apraxia, or maybe there's multiple things going on. So it could be a combination. So yeah, sometimes it takes longer. And sometimes I've even told parents, I suspect this is what it is, but they don't have enough speech yet. They're not able to imitate me. So I can't really probe a whole lot. So let's do some therapeutic intervention, or, some diagnostic intervention, just to see, let's try some things to see if I can get them to start producing more sounds. And I think I'll get a clearer picture as we do a little bit of therapy, trial some therapy. So yeah, that happens all the time. But for the most part, we can pretty much, if we're looking at the right thing, if we're doing all, getting as much as we can in our assessments, getting all the information, usually by the end of the hour, and usually it doesn't take me more than an hour unless it's for apraxia. That's a little bit more in depth. It's a dynamic motor speech assessment. But by the end of it, I can pretty much look at that child's speech errors and say, okay, there is a speech sound disorder. That much I'll say. And then I'll just describe what's going on, characterized by. And then I'll list the phonological errors. I'll list the articulation errors. I'll list the characteristics or the features that they present with that are consistent with apraxia or dysarthria. And so for the most part, if you know what you're looking for and you're comfortable with that, then you can start to feel more comfortable with that diagnosis. But again, like with apraxia, you have to have some expertise in that. And that just takes time and training. And not every SLP is going to feel super comfortable diagnosing, and nor should they, because honestly, it's a fairly rare speech sound disorder. I think it's one child out of 1,000. Wow. Or 3 to 5, I think it's 3 to 5% of kids with speech sound disorders will have apraxia. So it's frequent enough to where you'll probably have a child on your caseload, but it's infrequent enough to where you're not going to feel, oh yeah, I treat this all day, every day. I'm super comfortable assessing and diagnosing it. So that's kind of the double-edged sword with apraxia. So sometimes, yeah, if you're a generalist SLP, if you're in the schools or even, any other setting where you don't just specialize in speech sound disorders, you're probably not going to feel very comfortable giving particular diagnoses. But I think just the more we learn, just a little bit in little bite-sized chunks, we can all start to feel a little bit more comfortable with all of it.
Yeah, and I love that reminder. I think it's a good reminder, whether you're new in this field or been in this field, that I think there's this feeling like, well, I have to get done with this assessment and know exactly what's going on and be able to say exactly what's going on. But that's not always the case. And I love that reminder that sometimes we can say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. But that you can start to do some different interventions. And then that's going to oftentimes fill in some of those missing pieces as well, to know, oh, wow, this is really impacting this and making a change here. So, it's like any other profession where there's diagnoses going on. It's not always that you go to a medical professional and they say, I know exactly what it is all the time, every time.
Right.
Oftentimes they don't know. So
right. And like I've frequently given suspected apraxia of speech as a diagnosis, just because, maybe the child doesn't have enough speech yet, or, they weren't able to participate well during the assessment. So we can still treat as if they have a particular disorder and just say, this is a working diagnosis.
Yeah,
we're going
like
to, it may change as we progress in therapy.
No, I love that. Working diagnosis. I think that's a great way to phrase it. And for those listening that, let's say they are like a school-based SLP, or they are an SLP that works with children but they don't have that expertise in apraxia, because like you said, it is very specialized. I remember had a handful of kids that most likely that's what they had. I did not know what I was doing. I did not know how to treat it. I felt so, again, apologies to those children out there who are probably, adults now, but yeah. So what do you recommend if I'm working with a student and I'm doing my differential diagnosis and I'm thinking, this feels like that? Where should they refer? Like, what do you recommend?
So yes, if you feel like you are not yet comfortable giving that diagnosis, be honest with parents, honestly, because I get those referrals all the time, even from, school-based SLPs. They will say, we don't have this expertise.
Yeah.
Here's a couple people that do. So, I get those referrals too. But then start to think to yourself, are you at a point in your mindset that you feel like you want to get more training? Where I send people is to Dr. Edith Strand, who was like the guru of childhood apraxia of speech. And she has free ASHA CEUs that are available online. Like, I think it's 6 hours or something. Like, it's an insane amount of free ASHA certified CEUs. So I have those linked on my resources page as well under the apraxia tab. Because that's, if I have an SLP, ask me, I don't know what to do, I've never had this, go there. That's where we go first. That's where you kind of dip your toe into the world of apraxia to figure out, because first we have to understand what apraxia is.
Yes.
It is a set of characteristics or features of the child's speech that we have to be comfortable identifying. That's how it's recognized. And so it's somewhat subjective, right? Because the quality of the diagnosis is very much dependent upon who gave the diagnosis. And the only way to do that is through a dynamic motor speech assessment. And so you can go take that course. I believe it's offered is it the Once Upon a Time Foundation? I think paid for that, and it's available on childapraxiatreatment.org, I believe is the website, but I've linked it all on my resources page on my website as well too. So people can just go there and find it. But that's where I tell people to start.
That's great. And again, we're going to link put all of your information in the show notes so that people listening, you'll be able to go to the show notes and find the website and
great
Instagram and all the other resources that you provide. So a wealth of knowledge. And once you do, and I know this is going to differ depending, but what is your process for establishing goals and your treatment plan following that differential diagnosis process?
Yeah. Because the differential diagnosis really does determine what I'm going to be addressing with that child. I write different goals in different ways. So if I have a child who has phonological errors, I'm writing a goal with a phonological pattern in mind. So if I'm thinking this child really reduces their clusters, how can I address that? And so I'll write a goal for reducing this phonological error pattern of cluster reduction by producing these S clusters in a particular word position with particular accuracy, maybe upon a given speech probe or, during conversational speech. And those goals will be different because for phonological based errors, what the literature has shown is that if a child starts to produce these targets in spontaneous speech with about 50% accuracy, 50% of the time, the rest is likely to emerge on its own. So I can put that sound or that pattern kind of on the back burner, and I can start remediating or working on other things. But if it's a motor-based issue, that's not necessarily the case. And so if it's like a lateral lisp, 50%, I'm going for 100%, right? Because this is a motor-based distortion and I want muscle memory to start kicking in to teach that child how to, learn how to produce this sound. We're reteaching a motor movement. And so we need 100% accuracy. So I almost always write my goals for like 90, 100% accuracy for those types of errors. And for our kids who have apraxia, that differential diagnosis, we're not going to write goals for sounds or patterns. We're going to write goals for movement. And so I write my goals using sounds that are in the child's inventory. And they need to be fairly open-ended because since it's a movement-based disorder, we need to write movement-based goals. And so it's not about saying the R sound, right? Because if we have a child who's apraxic and we're working on R in isolation for 2 months, we're not working on movement. We're working on a sound. So we need to work at that syllable level and higher using sounds that are already in their inventory so that we can teach them how to take those sounds and make fluid, accurate, consistent movement with those sounds. And so I'll write a goal for 20 new target words using the sounds in their inventory to produce these words consistently. And I leave it open-ended because I often don't know what words we're going to be working on. One time, this little girl was telling me about SETI. I thought, SETI, what? Oh, spaghetti. Guess what word we're going to work on today? Because I know you have all those sounds in your inventory, and I could cue her for accuracy. So that was one of our words that we used to write in her goal that I wanted her to start to use in functional communication. And so, you're going to write goals very differently across the board.
Well, I'm having many aha moments during this conversation, but just hearing you say that, I'm like, yes, that makes perfect sense. Like, I feel like all the goals are with a sound in mind, but you're right. That's not going to get you to where you want to go. That's missing the
and
path.
That's why our kids with apraxia stall in traditional speech therapy, because we're not it's a paradigm shift for SLPs. And I get it. It's hard to get our brains away from sounds, right?
Yeah.
But we have to think movement with these kids.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it, is like sometimes it's the sound, if it's for example, the lateral lisp, but you're right.
Yeah.
The other times it's the movement, and that getting that movement is what's, it's almost like thinking about, physical therapy where, the goal is going to run, but it's going to strengthen this, do this, and then ultimately then will impact their ability to run. But
exactly.
I think that's very, very, yes, mind shift is exactly, I think, the perfect way to say that.
It's a total paradigm shift. And I think that's but when we can wrap our mind around that, it's amazing. Like, I will tell parents, yes, apraxia it will take longer for your child than if they had a phonological deficit, but I should see improvement every day. Every day. We should still see improvement if we're really treating the deficit.
Well, and I think that's also probably feels really good to a parent to hear, because I mean, they're worried about their child. They want to see improvement. They want to see. So yeah, that's, and I know we could probably talk about, you have a lot of resources and knowledge just even about the treatment piece. And so we'll also direct people to your website, because some of your CEUs directly talk about that as well.
Mm-hmm. I have. I mean, if you go on I'm starting to do my own webinars and record more courses. We're going to do another speech sound disorders series through Bright Ideas this fall that I do with Jenny Bioram and Rebecca Ranking. So, there's a lot of opportunities. If you follow my newsletter, you're going to hear about all those opportunities to learn about speech sound disorders. Follow me on Instagram as well, too, because it's a lot. It's a lot to learn. But like I said, if you just take it in bite-sized pieces and know where to go, there's some fantastic websites like Caroline Bowen's website. I frequently go on there if I need to remind myself or just learn about something new. Jennifer Taps Richard has a great website for complexity approach. If you just kind of keep in mind, okay, where do I go if I need to remind myself about, what do I do for apraxia again? What do I do for, lateral lisps again? I have a recorded lateral lisp course. One of my favorite things to treat, and I think it strikes fear in the heart of every SLP if they get a kid with a lateral lisp, but is my favorite thing to treat. I absolutely love it because I just use a few different types of cueing. But again, we have to kind of find out what the nature of the disorder is and then treat it accordingly.
Well, and I think if you're listening and it is one of those things where, lateral lisp, that's probably a sign that just having more of those resources and again, that course that you teach, going to get that's going to take away some of that, lateral lisp, because
I hope so.
Most of the time we feel that way because we don't feel equipped, or that, I don't know enough. But once that's that knowledge is power. And then our kids are going to be off of our caseload sooner. They're going to be able to avoid being in speech their whole life. And again, then you're going to be less burned out and just have more of that.
Well, and if it seems like a lot too, I'll tell SLPs, okay, then pick one kid on your caseload. Just pick one kid that's a puzzle and just figure out what do you think is going on with that kid, and then find out what the intervention would be for that child. And that's the intervention you're going to learn that year. And that's the one you're going to kind of take a deep dive to help this one child that seems like a bit of a puzzle. Like if you have this lateral lisper that, oh my gosh, they're in 6th grade and they've been in speech for 7 years since kindergarten, and they're over it, you're over it, but mom and dad still want them on your caseload. take the lateral lisp course. It's why I developed it really was because like I said, when I went across to different schools working as a contract worker, there was always a fifth grader. Literally always a fifth grader on every caseload that had a lateral lisp. And so I started using some of these ideas about phonetic shaping and cognitive reframing that helped get renewed buy-in for these kids, and coming at it from a completely different way. Literally telling them, forget everything you've ever learned because it hasn't worked for 6 years. So why are we doing it? So let's stop doing that. Let's do something new.
Yeah, that is a great comment to finish on. I know this is barely, not even the tip of the iceberg of the information that people can find more about all of this, speech sound disorders, and the work you're doing on your website will direct people there. And I'm sitting here thinking, gosh, I wish I would have had this knowledge when I was working. I would have just saved myself so much just frustration and lack of knowledge and understanding. And also thinking about these, I wouldn't be apologizing to all of the students I am now, but Amy,
we all have kids we need to go back and apologize to, believe me.
I know. I'm like, I feel like the list is getting longer the more I learn. But thank you for just going into this field and for focusing on this, because it's such an area that I think so many of us get stuck on, and you have really got it figured out. So, and are great at sharing that information with us. So thank you.
Thank you. I will say though, just when I think I have it figured out, I get that kid that humbles me. So I never want to think I have it all figured out.
Yes. We all can picture that kid as you're saying it, where it's like, oh, no. You're not following the rules of how this goes. So yes, but that's what makes us continue to have to just like learning. It never ends, right? Never, ever. So
exactly. Never.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here today, and encourage everybody to go check out your website, and we'll link those. And thank you for all that you do and for sharing all that with us.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up this episode. Thank you for tuning into SLP Full Disclosure. For more information about this episode, check out the show notes on our website at medtravelers.com/SLP Full Disclosure. And don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so you never miss a guest. Are you interested in becoming a travel SLP? Visit medtravelers.com to learn more and explore the exciting opportunities we offer at top-level facilities across the country. Also, a special thanks to Jonathan Carey for producing this episode, and Aiden Dykes for the music and editing. And as always, this episode was powered by Med Travelers. See you next time.